Hi and welcome to this video where we're just going to focus on this gearbox now from my Mini, and because my Mini was made between 2001 and 2004 and it's the non-supercharged model, this would be the Midlands gearbox, or the R65 as it's known. Now it does suffer from a few issues. The synchros can wear out, fifth gear is quite weak. They do advise that you accelerate in the other four gears and take it very steady in the fifth gear. And also the input shaft bearing can wear, and that's noted by when the car's in neutral that you can hear a slight bearing noise, which I'm not sure this one may have actually had that. I can't remember now. Obviously when I put the gearbox back in, I'll probably find out that yeah, the input shaft bearing was on its way out. Also the pinion bearing can fail, and you can tell that by, as the faster you go, the more the bearing noise increases. So yeah, so there are a few issues with this. But anyway, so the intention is definitely take this cap off here, have a look at fifth gear, remove fifth gear, and that then should enable me to remove the rest of the housing so that we can actually have a look at the gears inside, which is what I'd like to do. I don't want to destroy the gearbox because I still want to be able to use it, but yeah, I'd like to know a little bit more what's going on inside it. So hopefully that's going to be an enjoyable video, and I'll crack on with that now, and thank you for watching. So here's some overview photographs before I start to open things up. So here we can see the clutch release lever, the breather, the gear selector lever, the differential housing, the input shaft, and the location of the right drive shaft. And in this photo you can see the clutch release fork in purple, the clutch release bearing in orange, and the input shaft in yellow. And in this one we can see the reverse switch in white and the fifth gear cover in blue. And this is an end view where you can see the reverse switch and the various fasteners in yellow. And finally in this photo we can see the fifth gear end cover in blue, and the gearbox oil filler plug and the drain plug in yellow, and the location of the left drive shaft. So removing the clutch fork lever, or maybe not. So in theory there's a pin there that needs to be hammered out. So that's the clutch lever in operation there. Now the case is a casting, so it is somewhat fragile. So I thought, well, we'll use a G-clamp here just to hold that lever up so I can see that pin that needs to be hammered out. And I'd also support the shaft with a socket extension, like so. Now that should be quite secure for when I start pounding away with a punch. So here goes. I did think it would actually just come straight out, but after a lot of tapping it wasn't actually going to come out. Now on the internet people do seem to say that this pin just mashes itself up and it's easier just to cut the lever off or something. Obviously I wasn't going to do that because I still needed it, so that was a no-go. That's where I was worried that it might actually split apart if I didn't support that pin. Might be worth just noting that if you do it. Right, so removing the clutch release bearing, and this was simple enough. This very easily just pops off. So can't go wrong there. And there's a couple of little plastic clips on the back, as you can see. Obviously you don't want to break those, but that was nice and easy. So on to removing the reverse switch. So for this you can use a 19mm spanner, but because you've got a connector on the top, I opted for a cruise foot, like so, and that was nice and easy as well. So you can just spin that out, and we can actually see the little dimple on the end that the lever inside the gearbox pushes on. Or it drops away, I think. Not quite sure. I think it might actually drop away and switches on when the lever moves. Okay, so I'll now get this into position, and we'll try and remove the 5th gear now. And this is where it did test my tooling somewhat. So a quick photo here showing the rear cover and the 3 fasteners holding it in place. So using a 10mm socket on a breaker bar. These are easy enough to remove. I did find for a lot of things though, the gearbox does need to be clamped to the table to make things easier. Okay, so they're now loose, so we can just spin these 3 bolts off. Just checking the length of them. They are all the same length. So this is the first time I've ever opened a gearbox up, so I have no idea what's actually inside. This is a first for me. So what do we have? Box of magic here. And we got some precision parts there. So we've got some sort of oil drainway inside the end case, unless it feeds oil inside. We've got a rubber seal, just remove that. I do believe that's reusable. And we've got 5th gear on the top, so let's have a look at this in operation. So push down, and we can see it popping up and down there. Gives you an idea of the complexity of a gearbox. Definitely not a simple device. So my plan is just to remove the case on this. I'm definitely not planning to start stripping this gearbox, because it's definitely out of my league. But we will try and have a look inside it. So we do need to remove those gears at the top, which is the 5th gears. So I'm trying to show that's reverse. Just gives you an idea of what's actually going on when you start moving the gear lever inside the car. Quite a lot happens. Right then, I think we'll get to it then, and we'll remove the roll pin from the 5th gear selector fork. So you do need to note that a new pin should be used once you've actually punched this pin out. So out this comes. At least this one actually did come out, unlike the other one on the clutch lever. So there's the little pin. Almost panicked there that it might have dropped inside the gearbox. Little magnetic pickup can be very handy, like so. So we now need to lock the gearbox by engaging 1st gear and pressing down on 5th gear selector fork, and simultaneously push selector to engage 5th gear, if you understand all that. And this should lock the 2 shafts. So that's free to turn at the moment. So it's 1st gear, like so, and then without that split pin in we can push it down now, and those are nicely locked. So we can now tap out the 3 indents on the 2 lock nuts and loosen the 2 lock nuts, but don't remove them fully just yet. So what I did was just to make a little tool to knock those indents out. So I just took a metal rod and ground away one side of it, like so, just to make a sort of chisel, just to help push those indents back out that are on the lock nuts. So it looks alright, so we'll have a try now. So there's 2 on this shaft, this is the secondary shaft. So it's just enough to push those out without causing any damage, because I'm going to be reusing these lock nuts and you shouldn't actually reuse them. But for that reason I didn't want to damage them while trying to get them off. Well, you can see why you should replace them with new ones anyway, because you're physically damaging them while you put them on. Then I just used a little pin here just to finally push the remainder of the indentation out. Did work, but it did get stuck in one of them. I think this one it got stuck in. There we go. Had to tap it up gently, try and get it out. Okay. So we can now use a 32mm socket, and you definitely will need to clamp the gearbox to the bench. You're not going to do it like that. So I'm going to use 3 clamps here just to secure this in place, because those 2 nuts are quite tight. Okay, so even with it clamped to the table, it took a fair bit of push on that. That's one off. So you just got to loosen them, but don't remove them completely just yet. I think we need a longer breaker bar on that one. Yeah, took me a bit of effort that. Maybe not the strongest person. Okay, so I'm just going to loosen those off as much as I can so I can remove them with my fingers when I need to. So we can now unlock the 1st and 5th gear. So I'm just taking it out of 5th there, popping it back into neutral. So that's now ready. So that we can remove the lock nuts, the stop plate and the slide the 5th gear assembly with selector fork off the shaft. Again, I will mention new lock nuts must be used on the rebuild. So, like I say again, this synchro hub lock nut should be discarded. There was a little bit of metal swarf there from removing that. And this is the stop plate. The magnet was quite handy here just to lift that off. And then what we need to do is slide the 5th speed gear synchro assembly and the selector fork off the selector shaft. Being very careful, because I definitely don't want anything to fall apart, because I don't think I'd be able to get it back together again. So I'm trying to keep everything nicely together. And obviously put it all in order on the table. Like so. So now remove the 5th gear synchro ring with the driven gear, and then the needle bearings, the bearing collar, and finally the spacer washer. So I think this is the synchro ring. So we need to lift that up with the 5th speed gear, which I believe is that, off the output shaft. And there we can see the needle bearing still in position. I was a bit worried those needle bearings might all fall apart on the floor, which would be catastrophic. But thankfully they came off in one piece. So once that's up, we can see the bearing collar is still on the shaft. That was somewhat oily, so carefully lift that up like so, and then we've just got the spacer washer at the bottom there. Now there is a slight indentation on this side, so it might be worth noting that. Okay, so I'm just going to put these pieces back together because I am somewhat paranoid in case they all get mixed up, or heaven forbid they roll on the floor or something nasty. So keep all that in order. So we can now go over to the input shaft. So we need to remove the lock nut, and with a suitable puller, definitely not a cold chisel, remove the 5th gear from the input shaft. Again, new lock nuts must be used on the rebuild. Okay, so take that 32mm lock nut off. Now the method I used here is one I would definitely not recommend. It was because I was very intent on removing this casing off the gearbox. Now at this point really I was stuck. My puller was not going to fit, so I resorted to something which is probably highly not recommended. But like I say, since the car is not actually planning to go back on the road, hopefully this will not really matter. But keeping the video going was more important to me than how I removed this gear. So anyway, so that is the 5th gear off. Doesn't appear to have had any damage. So it doesn't seem to be marked or anything. So hopefully no damage caused. So we now need to remove 4 Torx screws. So remove the 4 Torx screws securing the input and output shaft bearings, and remove the lock rings. Again, new Torx screws must be used on the rebuild. So here's a little photo to show those locking rings, which are in red. So we've just got 4 Torx screws to remove, and you'll need a Torx 40 for that. So again, it's going to be a lot easier if you actually clamp the gearbox to the bench. But my overhead camera, I didn't want it to actually see the floor, so I kept trying to avoid doing that. But anyway, so it's a Torx 40 to remove these 4 screws, and they should be replaced. Now, as I noticed when they were removed, they did appear to have some red lock nut on, thread lock. So I did personally reuse these, but like I said, you shouldn't. They should be new ones when you come to rebuild. So really, when you're doing anything like with a gearbox, you do need to expect a lot of parts will need to be purchased. So really, if you're going to do anything with the gearbox, it probably makes a lot of sense to do the whole thing start to finish, dare I say, properly. It does seem to be a very specialist item, I must say. I was quite surprised at how complicated all this was. So you need to use a drift possibly to pull these lock rings off. These are the bearing lock rings. This one was a little bit tighter on the secondary shaft, so you do need to tap them off. Note the position they're in, because there is like a beveled edge to these, so when you come back to putting it back together, you obviously need to get that beveled edge upright. I'll try and show those as clear as I can. Okay, so we should better go on to the housing now of the gearbox. Now for that, we now need to remove the 16 bolts securing the gearbox cover to the clutch bell housing. And there are 4 long bolts. Okay, so I'm definitely going to clamp the gearbox down for this. There's no way I'm going to hold it in position. Now it's a 10mm socket to undo these, and I did run into some problems. Now the casing of the gearbox is obviously cast aluminium and the screws are metal, so you can get a sort of corrosion forming. So I had 3 bolts here that really were going to play up. So I tried just wiggling backwards and forwards to loosen them, but they were going to prove to be a problem. You could hear it just clicking away there. I didn't want to force it in case I shear one of the bolts. Now the other ones were all okay. They all came out without an issue. So I'm going back to these troublesome 3. That's one of them. Just keep trying to work it backwards and forwards, but you can feel it binding and it just doesn't want to come out. And you know that if you just put too much push on it, something's going to give. So I did try. So those bolts actually do protrude to the other side as well. So again, I was working it backwards and forwards. So if you do open the case, and that's what happens. So one of them is now sheared off, and I was trying to be as careful as I could. So I thought, right, okay, we'll be even more gentle with the other 2. It did take quite a while. I'm feeling there to see if the actual bolt is turning underneath and it's not just twisting, getting ready to shear itself off. But thankfully it came out. You can see all the plus gas dripping out of that hole. So I put plenty of plus gas on there. Now I'm going to just mark these in yellow paint for your reference, so you know which ones were troublesome, and just to go a bit careful with those. Now 4 of the bolts are longer. Now this one was quite interesting because it had quite a bit of grease on it. I don't know why that one bolt had grease on. So unless this gearbox has been opened before. So the normal bolts were about 40mm in length, but the longer ones, which there are 4 of, are 17mm in length. I'll just show you each of those so you know where those long bolts come from, and then back to the short ones for the rest of the gearbox. And again, I'm going to mark the longer bolts in white paint so you can note that those are different, like so. Okay, so we've got 15 of the 16 bolts out without breaking them, but obviously I've now got a problem. I'm going to have to deal with one of those bolts and try and get it out. Right, so we're nearly ready to remove the housing now. So the next step is to use a soft mallet and tap the gearbox case to break the seal. So nearly at the point of the great reveal. And the only gearbox I did see once was that out of a Austin Allegro back in 1993. So this is very new to me, because that had the gearbox in the sump as well, so that was quite a unusual design. Okay, ready for the lift off. Let's see what's inside a gearbox. So a lot of precision gears there, and we can see the very large one, which is part of the differential. That's the one down there in the bottom right hand side. Okay, so now to drill that broken bolt out and retap the M8 hole. I'll speed most of this up. So one of the most important things with removing a broken thread is to actually centre punch it perfectly central. That was slightly out, which was a shame, because all the work, although it worked, could have been slightly better. So I started off with a small drill bit, gradually worked myself up. I did try to use some of those threads, reverse threads tools, but none of them worked. I feared that they'd actually snap in the hole as well, just adding to my problem. So eventually I drilled through as close to the M8 as I could get, making sure none of that swarf got anywhere near the gearbox. So I used the standard 3 taps here. You go sort of coarse, medium and then fine, the final one. So that's the medium, that's a medium M8. And just gradually work it backwards and forwards. So there was a slight lip there, which was from the old thread, which was a little bit frustrating, because it was nearly perfect. But as you can see, there is a slight lip there from that old one. But it was basically out. We've got a new thread there, and it does mean I can bolt the gearbox back together again, which is what was important. Okay, so a very basic attempt now to show the gears going into each gear. So this is just for sort of information, light-hearted information, I'm going to say. So this should be first gear. So I'll show that a couple of times. I have tried to double check that these are definitely going into the correct gears. And now this should be second gear. Like so. So it's just to give an idea of what's actually happening inside the gearbox when you're actually changing gear. So this should be third gear now. And you can see those syncro rings helping the gears change, because on reverse there is no synchro rings. And as you'll see in a moment, trying to get reverse in was a lot more difficult because there's no synchro on reverse. Here we go, this is reverse. So as you can see, as it went up, the teeth sort of hit each other. They don't just slide in nicely like on the rest of the gears. So let's give it a little bit of help there. I'll just give it a slight turn. There we go. So that's the reverse gear going up and down, and no synchro on the reverse. And here's just the gears turning, just to give you an idea of what's happening. Right then, so now refitting the gearbox case, you will need some silicon based compound. So what you do need to make sure is that the selector seal is in the correct position. You definitely don't want to put it all back together and find that seal wasn't in. Now I'm going to clean the surfaces with a bit of brake cleaner. I have removed most of the bits of silicone that were there. Wasn't a lot there actually, it was only a very small amount. So give the case a clean, because we've got to run a bead of silicone around the housing now. Yep, the odd little bit of silicone there. Now remove the grease from my fingers. Okay, so with some RTV sealant, it does just say silicone based compound. I'm going to try and put a very thin bead around the inside of the case, like so. That's actually quite a thick bead, really. Probably doesn't need to be that thick. But you get the general idea. Now this part here, I wasn't quite sure whether that should have been siliconed or not, but I did anyway. Okay, so that should be ready to now lower onto the bell housing part, like so, and on it goes. So we just need to put all those 16 bolts back in now. So one of them is going to be slightly different, which is the one that I had to mend. So you start from the middle. Okay, so refit the 16 bolts, remembering that 4 were longer, and tighten from the centre outwards. So they say tighten from the centre outwards. So I'm sort of hopefully doing this in the correct sequence. That is the centre of the gearbox. So it's 10mm socket again for doing this. I'll try and speed most of these up. Obviously the longer bolts are quite important to get those in the right place. So this is the one which I've obviously had to re-tap. Well, at least we have got a fixing in there. It should do its job. This is one of the bottom ones as well. So if it was going to leak the oil, yeah, it would definitely be probably from that one. So you tighten these to 28 Newton meters. So again, starting on the centre of the gearbox and working out. I presume this is what they mean. Find out when I put the oil back in. We're going over to the longer bolts there with the white paint on. You can actually see the silicone starting to ooze out. Probably put a little bit more in there than was needed. And then finally the tapped one at the bottom. Alright, so hopefully that's that job done. So now we can refit the bearing locking rings on the 5th gear. So make sure you get the position correct. So because there's the chamfer there. And the chamfer was uppermost. So it does say just tap these in and use a little punch if you need to. So line those up ready. And then the one on the secondary shaft, that was a little bit more problematical. Did have to use a drift on that one, or a little punch. Okay, so he's on. Let's just spin him around to line up the thread holes, like so. Now you are supposed to use new Torx fasteners here. I am reusing the old ones, so that's not what you're supposed to do. So we're now going to fit the Patchlock Torx screws, and these will be tightened to 30 Newton meters. Okay, so I'm going to put a little bit of red thread lock on because I noticed they had red thread lock. Now, like I said, you are supposed to replace these with new ones, and they probably would come pre-smeared with thread lock anyway, if that's what they're supposed to have. So again, Torx 40 for this. We'll just spin those down and then get the torque wrench, and that is set to 30 Newton meters. So we'll need to clamp the gearbox for this part, otherwise we'll be spinning it all around the table. There's our 1 click, whoops, 2 clicks, 3 clicks, and 4. So hopefully that would be fine anyway. So now we're on to refitting the 5th gear onto the input shaft, and you must support the input shaft from the bell housing side, as the shaft is shorter. Not supporting it may cause damage to the bearings as you tap the 5th gear back on. So you will need to refit a new 5th gear lock nut, but do not tighten just yet. So you do need to make sure that input shaft is supported on the other side, because you are going to be tapping downwards, which could be effectively tapping straight onto a bearing and causing some damage to the surface of the bearings while you're tapping this in place. So that's basically in place now. So we could put a new lock nut on there. It must be new, and then tighten that roughly with a 32mm socket. So now we can fit a new spacer washer to the output shaft, then the bearing collar, the needle bearings, and the 5th speed driven gear and synchro ring. So it does say that the spacer washer, this one here, is supposed to be replaced with a new one. Now I've kept everything together with those needle bearings in, so I'm just popping that on all in one go. So now we can fit the 5th gear synchro assembly and selector fork, the stop plate and a new lock nut, but don't tighten just yet. So carefully lift the 5th speed synchro assembly and the selector fork and put it onto the shaft, like so. So you might need to wiggle it slightly. So that seems to have gone on quite nicely. So the stop plate is already in position. So I'm just going to put the locking nut on. Again, that must be a new nut, and that will be tightened with a 32mm socket. And then what we need to do now is engage 1st gear, then press down 5th gear selector fork while engaging the 5th gear with selector lever. This is to lock the shafts like before. So 1st gear engaged, and then we push down and those are locked in place. So now we need to tighten the new lock nuts to 130 Newton meters. Okay, so torque wrench is set to 130 Newton meters, and so that's the input shaft, that's clicked, and now the secondary shaft. Now I think I should have staked the flanges first before taking it out of gear. So you may want to do this part now before you actually take it out of gear, because obviously these gears can now move. So it would have been slightly easier the other way. But anyway, so the flanges have been staked, and I now need to fit a new roll pin to the selector fork, and it does say a new one. So I'm just going to line the holes up with my little pin punch, and then we can just gently tap that new roll pin home, like so. Just check it's all going up and down nicely. All seems to be fine. Okay, so we can now refit the gasket on the gearbox end casing. And the gasket must be dry. So I'm just going to wipe the gasket and try and get as much of the oil off it, as it does say fit it dry. Now that might be to stop it squirming around as you tighten it, so it actually does grip a little bit when you start torquing it down. So we get that back on. Now I'm going to clean the surface as well with a little bit of brake cleaner, and then we should be able to just pop this cover back on, and the gearbox is nearly back together. So that's on. So we've just got to put in the 3 cover bolts and tighten them to 28 Newton meters. We'll just pop these in. I do normally clean these bolts as well with a wire brush before putting them in, just to get any aluminium swarf off them. So it's back to a 10mm socket, just to spin those down like so, and then set the torque wrench to 28 Newton meters for our 3 clicks. Second click, and finally the 3rd click. So we're basically all done. We just need to replace the reverse switch. So we just need to pop this switch back into position and tighten that with a 19mm spanner or crow's foot. And technically it should be torqued to 25 Newton meters, which is probably just about hand tight. So let's just quickly check the gearbox seems to work. We'll find out when we put it back on the car. Right then, so a few reference photographs. So here's a few photos of the 5th gear assembly with the end cover removed. And here's a photo of the bearing locking brackets. And here's a couple of photos showing all the fasteners that are holding the case onto the bell housing. This has been Inside the Gearbox on a MINI R50. And thank you for watching, and hope this video helps you have a slightly better understanding of your gearbox. This video was filmed and edited by me, Mark Savage, in July 2021, and I can be found on Instagram and Facebook under Coats and Gaiters.